continue with the discussion, I'll be discussing first Filipino historians during the Spanish period. The economic prosperity gave Filipino historians the opportunity to study in Europe and work for Philippine reforms. Jose Rizal, Marcelo del Pilar, Graciano Lopez Haina, Pedro Paterno, Antonio Luna, Mariano Ponce, and Isabelo de los Reyes are Filipino ilustrados who are considered as the first Filipino nationalist historians who defended the Philippines and the Filipinos from a very biased portrayal by foreign historians. What is La Solidaridad? It is an official organ of the propaganda movement where nationalist articles were published. These articles were dealt with the Philippine condition during and prior to Spanish colonization. These articles were The Philippines a Century Hence by Dr. Jose Rizal that predicts country's future and giving hope to the Filipinos that they will be free from the colonization of the Spaniards. Next is The Salan at Tuksuhan by Marcelo del Pilar. Marcelo del Pilar is considered as the father of Philippine journalism. His works in the Salan at Tuksuhan is all about using literary works to denounce the authority of the friars. Then the Fray Butod by Haina is about the friars' abusive doing during the Spanish era in the Philippines. Next is Ninay by Pedro Paterno. It is the first novel in Tagalog na inilarawan nito ang kayamanan ng kapaligiran at kultura ng Pilipinas. Ito ay nagsalungat sa sinabi ng Espanyol na ang Pilipinas ay walang kultura. Next is the writings of history during the American period. On June 12, 1898, General Emilio Aguinaldo declared the independence of the Philippines. The short-lived Philippine Republic ended with the capture of Aguinaldo in Palanan, Isabela on March 13, 1901. In this year, the American government decided to terminate the military government and replaced it with a civil government under the leadership of William Howard Taft. Generally speaking, the writing of history during this period can be compared better than the writings of history during the Spanish period, although most of the writings of the Americans about the Philippines were extremely biased. Still, there were few Americans who wrote in favor of the Filipinos. Historians during this period can be classified into Filipino Ilustrado, American colonial officials, non-colonial officials, and the so-called academic historians. Some known Filipino ilustrados are Pedro Paterno, Rafael Palma, Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, Epifanio de los Santos, Teodoro M. Calao, and Isabelo de los Reyes. Their socio-political affairs of the country led them to contribute to the development of Philippine historical writing. There are also Americans who made a tremendous effort in research to write the history of the Philippines. Some of them are Emma Helen Blair, James Alexander Robertson, Fred Atkinson, James Leroy, and Joseph Hayden. Although the Americans were critical to the Republic of Malolos and the American history in the Philippines. One is historical writings during the Third Republic. After the Philippines regained its independence in 1946, the newly established Philippine Republic has to confront several problems. Aside from the rehabilitation of the country, the newly established government had to face problems concerning national unity and national identity. In this light, the country was in need of history that will reflect the characters of the people and will serve as a unifying factor of the country. Here are some of the important occurrences in the history of the Philippines during this period. In the early 1950s, the writings continued to be dominated by traditional historians. The saying, no documents, no history, popularized by the positivist tradition advocated by Leopold van Rank in the early 19th century, continued to have support from the Filipino. History writing during this period was influenced by the Cold War. The Philippines, being known as an ally of the United States, tried to combat communism by privileging the achievements of the colonizers in the Philippine history. Historian Gregorio Zaide and younger scholars like Horacio de la Costa and Jose Arcelia had written their history books from a clerical point of view. Needless to say, most of the writings during this period are actually the history of colonizers in the Philippines. Basically, it's just like being rewritten. In the late 1950s, Teodoro Agoncillo revolutionized the writing of the Philippine history. In his effort to write the history of the Philippines using a Filipino standpoint, highlighted that 1896 revolution and considered 1872 as the beginning of the history of the Philippines as a nation. Agoncillo's argument that 1872 was the beginning of the history of the Philippines is that for the early years of 1872 was actually the history of Spain in the Philippines because the Filipinos then were just passive followers of the Spaniards. Also, there are controversies in Agoncillo's writings because of his questionable methodology like oral interviews, is not a popular practice at that time. Nonetheless, we cannot deny his contribution in writing the Philippine history. Following the footsteps of Agoncillo, Renato Constantino placed the masses of the center in the treatment of history. He emphasized that the real mover of history is the masses and Superman does not exist. Only leaders who become great because they were working with people. His book, The Philippines, A Past Revisited, departed heavily from the traditional treatment of history. Even though followed opinion about the oral interview, he believed in the existence of Philippine pre-colonial civilization. He argued that the pre-colonial Philippines developed the structure he termed as a communal democracy. Archaeological and anthropological findings in the late 1960s had given scholars the chance to reconstruct the history of the Philippines prior to and during the early years of Spanish domination. William Henry Scott and Dr. Landa Hocano were the leading scholars who specialized on the subject that concerns the pre-colonial civilization of the country. Some notable writings of them were Scott's Cracks in the Parchment Curtain and Dr. Hocano's The Philippines Prehistory. The two used different sources like the colonial documents, ethnographic accounts, and participants' observation archaeological data in their reconstruction of the Philippine past. Their works had given the historians new possibilities in the study of the Philippine history because of the inclusion of the different indigenous communities of the past that led to a better understanding, acceptance, and respect to the least accumulated Filipinos who tried to maintain their social order despite the threats of the colonizers. In his book Passion and Revolution, Lieto discussed how the people appropriated certain images in the Passion intended to make the people submissive became a subversive text to work in their side. for their side. In his presentation, Lieto had shown the masses treated the passion to work of their advantage. In this book, the author explained how popular themes in the Passion like Damayan, Loob, Liwanag, Lakaran, and Kalayaan were appropriated by the people to rebel against the colonizers. Rinaldo Lietos argued that the masses did not put into writings the participation of history since perhaps they regard themselves as irrelevant. So, in order to write their story, historians should deconstruct symbolic images that were part of the day to day activity of the people. For Lieto, it is proper for the historian to look into the other center of power, like folk, healers, and columns, because in doing this, historians will be able to present the other side of history that were muted by the dominant. Aside from Lieto, Vicente Rafael and Connie Alaras made significant studies using the tradition of analysis. Their framework. Vicente Rafael's Constructing Colonialism is a good follow-up to the work of Lieto. On the other hand, Consolacion Alara's Pamathalaan documented the world view of the Kapatiran. Documentation gave people the chance to understand the mentality of the Kapatiran. The works of Rafael and Alaras are good additions to historiographical literature. Lieto, both scholars tried to penetrate the mentality of the common people. They gave scholars new lands to interpret history and that will answer the challenges passed by the changing time and changing need. That's all.